Welcome. My name is Tom Adams, and I've written a book about the railroad car ferry Marquette and Bessemer No.2. The Marquette and Bessemer No.2 was lost in a brutal December storm in 1909 with all hands, and despite a myriad of mysterious and confounding clues, has never been definitively located. It's one of the last great mysteries of the Great Lakes. So, this is essentially the same presentation I've been giving at libraries and museums throughout northern Ohio over the last couple of years. If you didn't get to make one of these, there's a lot of good information about this story in it. If you're a fan of Great Lakes history, railroad history, or industrial history from the last century, I think you're really going to enjoy this. Or if you just like a good mystery in general. Anyway, I hope you like it, and here we go. To fully immerse ourselves in this story, we have to go back to the turn of the century. Here is a photograph of Conneaut Harbor, sometime around 1909, maybe a little earlier. At this time, Conneaut, Ohio was a major port, handling all types of materials, but especially coal from western Pennsylvania. As you can see in this slide, conditions on the lake were very different in 1909 than they are today. Very few ships had wireless radio. Radar was decades away. Harbors were not especially well illuminated. Transportation was primarily rail and shipping. The highway system really hadn't been built yet. Coal, especially western Pennsylvania coal, was king. It was used for everything from heating homes to running locomotives. Life saving equipment was primitive by today's standards. Weather could be brutal and volatile, and weather forecasting was an imperfect art to say the least. 1909 could best be described as a time of change in the shipping industry on the Great Lakes. For one thing, ships were migrating from the age of wooden ship to steel. Both the wooden freighter and the sailing ships, the barks and the schooners, were slowly falling by the wayside as steel manufactured ships were taking over the industry. The industry was consolidating after hard times in the 1890s. A lot of organizations were moving to more quantitative management. Does that sound familiar? The seafaring jobs were becoming much more specialized. And 1909 was also a year of significant labor unrest. One thing that was prevalent that year was that there was either a lockout or a strike, depending on who you believe. And the Lake Carriers Association created something called the Welfare Plan. It was a faux union hiring hall that was endorsed by the Carriers Association. Ships officers were encouraged to hire from the Welfare Plan Hall as opposed to the Seafarers Union Hall. 1909 was a record setting year for cargo shipments. 1909 was also a very deadly year for sinkings, accidents, and groundings. And it sort of backed up labor's argument at this time that many of the sailors being recruited from the welfare plan were not really fully qualified to be working on these ships. At this point in time, we're beginning to transition on the Great Lakes between wooden ships and barks and schooners to steel hulled freighters. The Shenango 1 epitomizes this transition in many ways. It was the predecessor for the Marquette and Bessemer No.2, and it was of wooden construction built in 1895 by the Craig Shipbuilding Company in Toledo, Ohio. The Shenango 1 was approximately 56 feet shorter than the No.2, underpowered, leaving much to be desired as an icebreaker. Now, most lake freighters emphasized economy over power and speed. Consequently, many of these ships were underpowered. But the railroad car ferries worked late into the winter, out early in the spring, and they often had to deal with pack ice. Consequently, they needed the ability to break out of these problems. And because of that lack of power, in 1904, the Shenango 1 became victim to this. She became trapped in pack ice outside Conneaut Harbor. She was captained by John McLeod, who ultimately became the first mate of the Marquette and Bessemer No.2. He's the brother of Robert Rowan McLeod. And in any event, and with a skeleton crew on board, the Shenango 1 caught fire in the spring of 1904. Charles McCarter, a fireman, was killed in the fire, and Chief Engineer Morrell was badly burned trying to save him. And as you can see in the subsequent slide, the ship was a complete loss. Here is a photo of the Shenango 1. As you can see, she is burning out of control outside Conneaut Harbor and is a complete loss. This photo is courtesy of the Father Edward J. Dowling, S.J. Marine Historical Collection at the University of Detroit Mercy Library. With the loss of the Shenango, an immediate replacement was required. This would have been the Marquette Bessemer No.2, with a length of either 338 or 350 feet, depending on reports, and a beam of 54 feet. The ship draft 14 foot, fully loaded. As was typical of the time, twin triple expansion coal-fired engines provided a speed of approximately 12 miles an hour. The cargo deck had 4 railroad car rails on it, and it was built by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorraine. A fully loaded ship constituted 30 rail cars and 200 tons of coal. Robert Rowan McLeod was the captain. Seen here is a data sheet for the Marquette Bessemer No.2 with some basic information and details about the ship. This is courtesy of the Father Edward J. Dowling, S.J. Marine Historical Collection, the University of Detroit Mercy Library. Here is a certificate of inspection for the Marquette Bessemer No.2. This was conducted in October of 1909, 2 months before she sank. As a newer ship, you wouldn't expect a lot of defects on an inspection, and there doesn't appear to be anything remarkable here. It is, however, interesting to note that the inspector appears to indicate the ship had 2 lifeboats when in fact it had 4. This document is courtesy of the Historical Collection of the Great Lakes at Bowling Green State University. One topic that's resulted in a certain amount of confusion is that when the original Marquette Bessemer No.2 that was built in 1905 and sank in 1909 was lost, the Marquette and Bessemer Dock and Navigation Company built a replacement ship the subsequent year to sail in 1910. It was virtually identical in every way, and it also had the same name, Marquette and Bessemer No.2. Consequently, photos of the original ship built in 1905 are rather rare. It only had a relatively short service life. Here's one of them here. You can see by the blow up of the cover photo that the upper pilot house is open on this boat, and it had a lower pilot house as well. When you look at it, the replacement ship, it has 2 enclosed pilot houses. So that's one way you can tell them apart. Otherwise, they are virtually identical. This photo is courtesy of the Father J. Dowling, S.J. Marine Historical Collection of the University of Detroit Mercy Library. Here is a great picture of the Marquette Bessemer No.2. As you can see, there's a lot of detail in this photo. One thing that I especially like is the great view of the stern. It highlights how open the stern was without a stern gate. Also, you see the rear pilot house, which was designed to help the ship in docking and loading. And it's got a typical 2-spar, 2-stack configuration. You'll note on the port side, the side nearest to us in the photo, that there are 2 lifeboats, one forward and one amidships, and there are matching lifeboat davits on the other side. As one can see in the previous photo, the lack of a stern gate left the ship somewhat vulnerable to following seas. The idea was that you tried to steer into the rough water as much as possible. There were supposed to be sluices to handle water that overflowed onto the rear deck, but it was definitely a hazard. Even when handling the boat correctly, Captain McLeod had almost lost the ship in a trough in November and was very hard pressed to right the boat. So he knew there was a problem, and the Marquette Bessemer Dock and Navigation Company knew the ship also probably would have been better off with the stern gate. They were planning to add it in that coming off season. This boat had no wireless, although that wasn't unusual for the time. Very few ships did. While there were sluices to handle the overflow of water onto the car deck, it's also possible that there were open hatchways to the lower levels. It might have only been covered by thin boards. The boat had a relatively low draft, and a relatively high freeboard. So it was a little top heavy, and as I said, vulnerable to a following sea. If the ship had lost maneuverability in a serious storm, that problem could be fatal. This ship was basically a self unloader. As you can see by the open rear deck there, you're just pulling rail cars on and off the ship. In order to tell the story of the Marquette and Bessemer No.2, we have to also talk about the Marquette and Bessemer No.1, as this ship plays a role in our story, and we can introduce it here. The No.1 left Conneaut for Ariao about 2 hours before the No.2 left on December 7th. It was built by the Buffalo Dry Dock Company, and it was a very unique design, rather a one off. She was smaller than the No.2 with a much lower profile. An author named Hilton derisively named the boat the Grasshopper and commented that she was anything but a beauty. She was commanded by Murdoch Rowan, cousin to Captain Robert McLeod. And there are a couple reasons why this boat is going to play an important role in figuring out some of Captain McLeod's actions during the storm. As you can see from this photograph, the Marquette and Bessemer No.1 was an unusual ship. You can see here the aft deck house is split on both sides of the boat, as are the stacks. This allows for ready access of the cargo deck from the rear of the boat. You should also note here that the ship is rather low in the water, not a great deal of freeboard. Here is an amazing photograph of the deck of the Marquette and Bessemer No.1. As you can see, the rails are placed onto the upper deck above the hold, and the hopper cars are rolled onto the ship. The cargo is unloaded. The rails would then be peeled up and hatch covers would be installed. When the ship reaches its destination, they would use a claw bucket to unload the ship. A pretty cumbersome process. You can see why this was not a long-lived design. In the discussion of other ships which are relevant to our story in some way or another, I also want to show you the SS City of Milwaukee. This is a more modern version of what the No.2 would look like, specifically with a stern gate. You'll recall in the earlier photos, the Marquette and Bessemer No.2 did not have a stern gate. The SS City of Milwaukee was built in 1931. Otherwise, it's pretty much very similar to the No.2. It had similar size, cargo capacity, and layout. Like many of the car ferries, she went on to a very long career. She also had wireless radio. This is not the SS Milwaukee that sank in Lake Michigan in 1929, obviously. Here is the photograph of the SS City of Milwaukee. This ship is located in Manistee, Michigan. I took this photo myself in 2015. You can see how the addition of the stern gate, when lowered, would offer the ship significant protection from a following sea. This will give the captain more freedom of maneuver, and it also would make the boat significantly safer. And this is the primary change between this ship and the No.2, as well as the wireless radio. So this is the safety improvement that Captain McLeod was waiting on but never got. One can't tell the story of the Marquette and Bessemer No.2 without at least touching on to the crew itself. There are some very interesting bits of information and history regarding the crew of this ship, some of whom we know a great deal about, and some of whom we know very little. And that's a topic that could warrant further research in the future. This photo, fairly rare as far as I know, may have been taken in the winter of 1906, 1907, somewhere in there. And this represents some of the crew of the ship who may have been on it when she sank. If you notice the large wooden poles in the prior photograph and were wondering what they were for, well, here you are. As a boat that operated very late and very early in the season, it spent a lot of its time contending with ice. Here are the crewmen breaking the ship free, apparently, using these wooden poles. Obviously, at times, very arduous and difficult work, very cold conditions. But they seem to be managing just fine. Both of these photographs are courtesy of the Historical Collection of the Great Lakes at Bowling Green State University. Captain Robert Rowan McLeod, captain of the No.2, was born on October 3rd, 1862,
in Kincardine, Ontario. If I have butchered that pronunciation, please let me know in the comments. He went on the lakes at the age of 12 years old, and for 35 years he'd never missed a season. He served in all types of various capacities on the boats and worked his way up through all grades of seamanship. Ultimately, he became captain of the steamer Osceola, and then of the Colorado and the Ann Arbor One. He moved to Conneaut in 1895 and continuously sailed from that port. For a time, he was captain of the Shenango One and then the Grand Haven. And he took the Marquette Bessemer No.1, the ship we saw earlier in these slides, out on its maiden voyage. And he also was the first and only captain the Marquette Bessemer No.2 ever had. Captain McLeod was widely regarded as an excellent captain with a long history of impeccable service on the Great Lakes. No one had a bad word to say about him, and to list all the people who had glowing praise for the man would make this section much larger than I'd intended. He was also widely regarded as one of the best navigators on the Great Lakes. John C. McLeod was the first mate of the Marquette Bessemer No.2, and also Robert Rowan McLeod's older brother. There are a variety of reported birth dates for John, but we're going to go with February of 1853 in Kincardine, Ontario. His Great Lakes service began in 1864, and he was serving on the lakes for 45 years continuously. Among the many roles that he had played, he was the captain of the Shenango One, which we saw earlier burning in Conneaut Harbor. Then he became captain of the New York. He returned to work with his brother. He still had his captain's papers, but was serving on the No.2 as his first mate. Frank Stone was the second mate of the Marquette Bessemer No.2. He was born July 11th, 1884 in Vermilion, Ohio. His family moved to Conneaut when he was only about a year old. He initially went to work in his father's jewelry business, where for 5 years he studied jewelry and became a master jeweler. He then took the job on the Marquette Bessemer No.2 as the purser. During that period of time, he studied and took his mate's exam and became the youngest pilot on the Great Lakes at that time. He also had a role as an officer in the local hook and ladder fire company, and he was a lieutenant in Company L of the Ohio National Guard. Frank Stone was a bit of a prodigy, uh, quite an accomplished young man. He did a lot in a very short period of time. R.C. Smith was the purser for the Marquette Bessemer No.2. He was born around 1882, as far as we can tell. He had not held that role for very long. He came over from the car ferry Ashtabula and joined the No.2 relatively recently. Chief Engineer Eugene Wood was about 40 years old, and he had resided in Conneaut for approximately 12 years. He originally was an engineer for one of the car ferries under George Cullinge. For 10 years, Eugene Wood had served under various capacities as the chief engineer for Captain Robert Rowan McLeod. They say that there was no finer engineer in the Great Lakes. First Assistant Edward Buckler had worked under Eugene Wood for 8 years. He was with the car ferry when it first came out and was one of the original crew members. He was about 33 years old at the time of his death. Second engineer Thomas Kennedy was reported to have been born in a small town in Michigan approximately 1878, and he had lived in Conneaut for about 11 years. He had worked under Eugene Wood as chief engineer for an extended period of time. He was also an original member of the car ferry's crew. Here we can go through the list of the remaining crew members, approximately 25 of them or so. You will see an asterisk after some of the names. That indicates that they were recovered later in the infamous lifeboat number 4, which we will talk about later in the story. Thomas Steele was about 24 years old. He was raised in Edinburgh, Scotland. and he'd been in the United States about 3 years, making Conneaut his home. For the last 2 seasons, he'd been sailing on the car ferry No.2, and he had told his friends that he felt that this would be his last trip, the one on which he met his death, and that he would be leaving the boat at the end of the season. Joseph Shank was also a fireman. He was about 25 years old and had been living in Conneaut for the last 3 years. He was originally from Switzerland, and he had only arrived in the United States a short few years ago. Uh, he was serving on the car ferry for the last 2 seasons. He had recently taken a vacation trip and had just returned to the boat 15 days prior to the fatal trip. For Joseph Shank's name, you will see some various spellings. I've seen it spelled Shenkk as well as Ank. Rene Rigglesworth was from New Sarum, Ontario. He has been in the ship about 4 years, and he was 22 years old. He's originally born in Norwich, England, however. He had expressed great reluctance to return to the ship, and apparently he was one of many crew members who had some apprehension regarding this late season trip. Fred Walker was one of the wheelsmen on the Marquette Bessemer No.2. We know very little about Fred. One thing we can be sure of, though, it's understood that Captain McLeod was very particular about his wheelsmen. So wherever Fred was from, he must have done his job well. Frank Annis was about 48 years old, and he had been a member of the car ferry for 2 seasons. He was originally born in Pomfret, New York State, and had lived in Conneaut the last 10 years. For a time, Mr. Annis had also worked for the Bessemer Railroad, and he had invented a device called a rail chair, which was designed to replace railroad fish plates. So obviously a talented gentleman. John Clancy was born about 1868 in Michigan. He was living in Cleveland for quite a while, and he was probably 40, 41 years old or so when the ship sank. He had a sister, Sarah, who reported having a vision of the ship sinking before it actually happened. Quite a haunting experience. There were two men from Cleveland, an M. Clancy and a B. Thompson, who had searched extensively on Long Point after the loss of the ship looking for survivors and wreckage. G.R. Smith is listed alternately as the steward and second cook. Uh, I would take it that he was in charge of the kitchen. Um, he was from Conneaut, Ohio. We don't have a lot of more information about Mr. Smith. Harry Thomas was the second cook. He was from Port Stanley, Ontario, and he was about 22 years old. He lived there with his parents and his brothers, Ernest and Nell. He was intending to leave the boat at Christmas and had laid out plans for his future. Unfortunately, he was never able to realize these. J.W. or Manny Sowers is 20 years old. There's a lot of divergent information about this young man. He has a couple different spellings for his name. I've seen it written several different ways. Purportedly, he was born in Portugal at the age of 6 and had moved to the United States at that time. He was very popular along the lake in Conneaut and had many friends. He had been sailing on the Great Lakes for several years, since the age of 16. This was his second season on the car ferry, and Dwight Boyer had reported he was one of the most popular members of the crew. Interestingly, his death certificate marks his country of birth as Italy, not Portugal. So there's still more research to be done on a lot of these individuals if one were to take the time. To dig any deeper is out of the scope of this book. In the previous slide, I did not intend to skip wheelsman William Wilson. There simply was not a lot of biographical information about him or an obituary that I could locate. He may have been from the town of Lindsay, but the specific state or province is unclear. We will talk about him a little bit later in the presentation, however. Charles Allen was approximately 18 years old, making him one of the youngest members of the crew. He was born and raised in Renovo, Pennsylvania, and he was living in Conneaut for approximately 1 year, working as a barber. He did not find the indoor work agreeable, and he had then taken a position on the car ferry about a month before the ship's loss. Patrick Keith was a coal passer on the number 2, and he was about 35 years of age. Keith had been attempting to get a position on the ship for about 6 months, succeeding only about a month before the ship's loss. John King was a coal passer, approximately 23 years old. He was born in Liverpool, England, and arrived in Canada in about 1907. King came from a seafaring family, and he had several relatives who had been lost to the sea. King had been with the Bessemer for about 6 weeks, and despite having a premonition about the ship's loss, stayed with the ship on its final voyage. King was one of several crewmen who appeared to have a sense of foreboding regarding the ship. William Ray, coal passer, appears to have been born February 21st, 1884, in Butler, Pennsylvania. Ray was the son of the former police chief. Apparently, he had been working on one of the dock's ore unloaders, and the season was coming to an end. As such, he needed employment. This was apparently his first trip on the car ferry, and he felt nervous, not liking the lake business. His fears turned out to be justified. Joseph O'Hagan was a coal passer. There are several different variations of the spelling of his name. At one point, he was mistaken as one of the crewmen recovered from the number 4 lifeboat. While Hagan was reported to be with the ferry, W. H. Jenkins, the local union rep for the Seamen's Union, was in Cleveland looking for relatives of William Wilson, and he reports discovering Joseph O'Hagan was not on the car ferry. I am not certain if we will ever know for sure if O'Hagan was on the boat or not. Jay Bailey was a coal passer, and he may have been born in Canada and was probably about 26 or 27 years old. Very little is known about Mr. Bailey. F. Barrett was a seaman from Wisconsin. He may have been born in Ireland in 1875, making him about 34 years old at the time of the ship's loss. William Harvey, also known as Ed, was a seaman of only 19 years of age at the time of the ship's loss. I have not been able to locate a great deal more information about him, though it appears he was from Port Stanley, Ontario. P. Hughes, we are not certain what the P stands for, was a seaman of about 45 years of age, and he was from Michigan. He had been with the car ferry since its launch in 1905 and appears to have been one of the more experienced crew members. D. Ball appears to be Earl Ball, who had just turned 19 right before the number 2 sank. Reports are that he had a brother who had just recovered from a 7-week hospitalization due to typhoid fever at the time of the sinking. It is inferred he is a resident of St. Thomas. Ball's mother wrote a heartfelt letter to the city of Conneaut that was reprinted in the Conneaut News Herald. I'll reprise it here in its entirety. Simcoe, Ontario, December 14th, 1909, to the Postmaster, Conneaut, Ohio. Dear Sir, I'm writing a few lines of sympathy with the mothers who have lost sons and the wives who have lost husbands in the sinking of the boat Bessemer No.2, as my son was a member of the crew that went down with it. This was his first year on the lake. He was only 19 years of age. His brothers John and Thomas both sailed on the boat last year. This makes 4 out of the Ball family who have met sudden deaths. This young man's father was killed 8 years ago while engaged in harbor improvement work at Port Burwell. If the body of my boy is recovered, please notify me at once. I hope they will find all the poor fellows who gave up their lives in this disaster. What suffering they must have endured. Yours truly, Mrs. John Garland. This letter reflects a family that has endured great loss. Work was dangerous and could be brutal in 1909. Charles Kreutz, seaman, was 25 years old, arriving to the U.S. from Aberdeen, Scotland 3 years ago.
He had been working on the number two for about 3 months. All of his family was purported to still live in Scotland, except that he may have had one brother in St. Louis. A letter arriving in Conneaut subsequent to the loss of the ship revealed that Charles was the sole support of his invalid father, mother, and sister back in Aberdeen, and that they were in destitute circumstances, having spent their last $5 on coal and facing eviction. This was brought to the attention of the local Elks chapter, who raised $35 to aid the family. John Wirtz, oiler, was born in 1869 in Saginaw, Michigan. Wirtz was another of the crew who had serious misgivings about the ship's safety and wrote his family before the ship's last trip. John writes, "The ferry was a dangerous craft, unstable in rough water, and he had constant fear for his life. He reports, the next trip will be my last. I'm going to leave the ferry boat and then seek other employment." Wirtz proceeded to tell of an accident to the Marquette Bessemer No.2 only a short time ago, in which the boat rocked so badly in a storm, nearly turning turtle, and the load shifted. Its load of cars nearly capsized the boat before they could be placed back into place. John Hart, oiler, was 38 years old and went by the nickname of Paddy. He was a typical follower of the sea. His home happened to be wherever the boat was. It appears that John Hart had been with the boat since its launch. Hart reportedly came from Ireland when he was a boy. In addition to rail cars, Marquette Bessemer No.2 also handled passengers from time to time. And in any account of the story, you'll read about Mr. Albert Weiss. He was the treasurer of the Bay State Iron Works and the Keystone Fish Company. He was a personal friend of Captain McLeod's and a prominent businessman. He was purportedly going to Canada to purchase a business, and the rumor is that he had a large quantity of cash on him, reported to be anywhere from $35,000 to $50,000. That, of course, is part of the impetus for some people looking for the ship. I have not been able to trace this really anywhere prior to Dwight Boyer's mention of it in his 1968 book, although there may be other sources out there. Not everything is online or available. And consequently, if that money is still there and it's most likely in paper currency, there's no way it has survived this long. I imagine that the pilot house and most of the upper cabins were destroyed in the wreck itself, and that money is long since unrecoverable. Although for years that has been the draw to looking for the ship. Largely ignored is another possibility of a second passenger on the ship. His name is Chris Johnson, and I came upon his name when looking through some records of the Erie Times News. And I'm just going to quote this verbatim. "It is also feared Chris Johnson, 321 4th Street, was on the ill-fated boat. He was supposed to make the trip from Conneaut to Port Stanley on Tuesday, and his friends have not heard from him since that time."
One additional crewman that may have been on the boat is a gentleman named O.T.W. Lander. We don't know a great deal about him, although it's suspected he was on the boat because when a lifeboat was recovered, there was an IOU with $5 attached, and it was signed by O.T.W. Lander next to some folded clothing. The gentleman himself was not recovered, but these items were in the lifeboat. And we'll talk about that more in the chapter on lifeboats.
Some men were fortunate enough to miss the final voyage of the number 2 car ferry. These include Michael Haruk. I've also seen this name spelled as Staruk. Michael was from Poland, and he has been listed as both an officer and a fireman on the car ferry. I believe the latter is more likely, as Michael spoke very little English. I'll quote here directly from the St. Thomas Daily Times. "On Monday, he, Michael, fell down an open hatchway and fractured his skull. Captain McLeod, skipper of the boat, who was a friend of Dr. Guest of this city, communicated with the latter and arranged to have the man return to St. Thomas to the Almondwood Hospital in a special coach attached to a pair Marquette train. This points to how well Captain McLeod treated his men and his concern for their safety. I think this is one reason why he was very well regarded as both an officer and a person. Michael Haruk must have made a full recovery. Upon his release from the hospital, he went to sail with the pair Marquette number 19 that was to cover the route of the Marquette and Bessemer and its loss. George Lawrence is listed as a porter on the number 2. He apparently was sent to find additional crewmen, including a fireman and a coal passer. Apparently, leaving Port Stanley on December 6th, the number 2 was slightly short-handed. George Lawrence was not only not able to locate anyone on the streets of Port Stanley, but he got distracted and missed his return to the boat as well. As such, he missed the final sailing of the ship and saved his life. Tom Cleaver was an oiler on the boat, and he suddenly decided to go back to working on land and became a porter in a hotel. William Tyler had left the ship 2 weeks before its final trip. For whatever the reason, these men were very fortunate to have missed that final trip on the boat. I titled the next chapter in my book Sailing into a Frozen Hell. I can't think of any more appropriate description for the weather on the lake the next couple days. We've already looked at our ship and our crew to an extent, and now we can get to our story. This takes us to Tuesday morning, December 7th. The Marquette Bessemer No.1 has already left harbor, and she is on her way to Ariel, Ontario. The Marquette Bessemer No.2's departure was delayed by 2 hours when a freighter tied up for the winter broke free, blocking the channel. The No.2 did not depart until this wayward freighter was cleared at 10:43 a.m. This is also the time when passenger Albert Weiss was just able to make the ship as it was leaving dock. The blocked channel should have been an omen. Poor weather at the outset of the No.2's journey deteriorates to a full-blown winter gale by nightfall. The barometer dropped to 29.6. Temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 10. Winds may have been as high as 70 miles an hour, and waves were climbing possibly as high as 30 feet at points. Telegraph lines were felled, and all the major railroads, including the Lakeshore and the Nickel Plate passenger lines, were forced way behind schedule because of the snow. This storm turned out to be a long Lake Erie storm with a duration of 3 days, which was very atypical on the Great Lakes. Weather was coming out of the south-southwest for the majority of the time, with some possible weather coming out of the northwest on Wednesday morning. The destruction on the lake was significant. The Clarion ran aground and caught fire, with 15 lives lost. 6 were saved, largely in part due to the bravery of the chief engineer, who climbed the smokestack and worked the steam whistle by hand in trying to signal a rescue ship. The Ashtabula, a Canadian Pacific Railway car ferry, ran aground near Port Burwell. The W.C. Richardson was smashed to pieces over time upon Waverly Shoal with a loss of 5 to 8 lives. The Josiah Munro was grounded trying to rescue crewmen from the Clarion. At least 59 lives were lost, and 3 ships were lost if you count the Marquette Bessemer No.2. Several others were damaged or grounded. It was a brutal, long-lasting storm. Out in this storm was the car ferry. The photo you see here is the channel at Port Stanley, Ontario. This picture was probably taken around 1910 or so. In the background, you see the replacement Marquette Bessemer No.2 that was built after the ship in our story was lost. One of the things that you have to notice about this picture is how narrow the channels are in these smaller ports. Entry in the channel is very difficult in rough weather, actually virtually impossible probably for a ship like the Marquette Bessemer with high freeboard. Consequently, we find that Captain McLeod does appear to have made it across the lake to Port Stanley, but he was not able to enter this narrow channel in that brutal storm. Consequently, he turned to port.
One of the things that contributes to the mystery of the Marquette and Bessemer No.2 is the vast array of reports of whistles and sightings of the ship throughout the storm of December 7 through 10. Many of these reports are mutually exclusive in that the ship couldn't be on one side of the lake and then 2 hours later be on the other side of the lake. As such, there are some errors in some of the reports, the reporting of the reports, or they're just flat out inaccurate. This contributes a great challenge in sorting out where the ship was and what was happening at the time. Additionally, some of these reports were later recanted as being false. I'm just going to go through them one by one. Mr. Wheeler, a Canadian customs officer, reports that the No.2 was laboring in rough seas late Tuesday afternoon outside Port Stanley. He also reported he saw the ship turn to port when he realized he couldn't make it into the harbor. You saw the photo of the narrow channel earlier. I buy this report. I think that the No.2 actually did make it to Port Stanley, and I think that Mr. Wheeler did see the ship turning to port. Mrs. James Holland and her son, who lived in Fairview, west of Erie, reported distress signals at both 7 p.m. Tuesday and midnight on Wednesday. I don't doubt that the Hollands heard something, but the No.2 couldn't have been off Erie and also at Port Stanley just 2 hours earlier. A long-standing reported historical error. A.H. Brebnar reports hearing a whistle that sounded like the car ferry early Wednesday morning. While having been reported as factual throughout the years, Brebnar himself recanted the story in the Conneaut News Herald. Also reported as factual for many years, the master and chief engineer of the steamer Black reported seeing the car ferry outside Conneaut Harbor Tuesday night. Subsequently, in the Conneaut News Herald, they recanted this story. It's not even clear if the Black was off Conneaut Harbor Tuesday night. Looking at its departure time out of Detroit, it may not have even had enough time to actually make harbor there. William Rice, an operator on the No.1 Hewlett at Conneaut Harbor. For those of you who do not know, the Hewlett is a large ore unloading machine. Heard distress signals and anchor signals around 1:30 a.m. Wednesday. As a harbor worker, he would have known the ship's whistle well, and I put some credence in Mr. Rice's report. Initially, I wondered what he would be doing out there trying to keep his machine from freezing up in the blizzard, but apparently the harbor was still working to an extent and hadn't been completely shut down for the winter. Here we have more whistles and sightings. Miss Adam Large, a resident of North Springfield, about 10 miles east of Conneaut, reports seeing the car ferry, which she knew by its lights, just before midnight on Tuesday. She believes it sank after she went into the house. This subsequent report here of a Finnish woman might be a duplicate of the first, but they're just different enough that I decided to separate them. A Finnish woman also reported seeing the car ferry Tuesday night east of Conneaut. She saw the ship heading to shore and reports putting a light out to redirect the ship. She subsequently saw the stern light of the ship turning away from the shore in the storm. She is adamant in her story. Mr. Wheeler, our customs agent in Port Stanley, again reported the car ferry off Port Stanley at 3 a.m. Wednesday morning. This is only a few hours after the sighting east of Conneaut, so the ship couldn't have been in both places at the same time. Mr. Wheeler's report was corroborated by two others. Then a resident of Port Bruce, which is located east of Port Stanley in Ontario, heard the ship's whistle so close to shore that he thought the ship had run aground. The Port Bruce resident may have reported this as Thursday morning. Here we have more sightings and whistles. Captain Matthew Payne, postmaster and former custom agent, is positive he heard the ship's whistle off Port Stanley at 5 a.m. Wednesday. Again, several residents corroborate his story. Then much later, Donna Isabel McLeod Rodabaugh, niece of Captain Robert and First Mate John McLeod, received a letter from Gladys Eagle, aged 93, on November 16, 1986. This was following a newspaper interview. In the letter, Gladys Eagle
says that she heard the whistle of the ship about 2 miles from the PA state line. She recalls thinking the ship sank there. She did not indicate a time in her letter. The letter is still at the Historical Collection of the Great Lakes, Bowling Green State University. This one fascinates me here. Sparsely reported Mrs. Robert Rowan McLeod reports hearing the whistle of the number 2 off Conneaut Wednesday night. The wife of the captain should surely know what the ship sounded like. What's difficult about this is in the report of Wednesday night, was this late Wednesday night or early Wednesday morning? The article isn't clear on this. One early report in the Conneaut News Herald puts Mr. Wheeler's 3 a.m. report on Thursday morning instead of Wednesday. So there's some confusion as to which day it actually was. Many of the reports of the ship's whistle seem fairly credible if somewhat contradictory in the details. One can pick and choose those that support the narrative events that they'd like to interpret, or dismiss them all, arguing that the fallibility of the eyewitness testimony is complete. Even if all are accurate, which cannot be, it doesn't exactly tell us where the ship may have gone down. One thing that is evident is that number 2 is definitely not heard from after Thursday morning, though these late accounts seem less concrete. It is impossible to tell for sure. While these various reports add to the mystery, terror, and excitement of our story, we cannot rely on them alone or to determine the location of the number 2 or what happened to her. Many of the eyewitness reports actually add rather than detract from the confusion of the story. As such, to determine what happened to our boat, we're going to have to look at the physical evidence. And we'll start with the lifeboats. The grisly discovery of lifeboat number 4, 15 miles northwest of Erie, Pennsylvania on Sunday morning, December 12th, by the state fishing tug Commodore Perry, is the first confirmation that Marquette Bessemer No.2 had without a doubt been lost. There were 9 frozen bodies on board. There's evidence of a 10th man. That would have been OTW Lander, who we had alluded to earlier as a man who may have been on the boat. This is the only lifeboat we can confirm was actually occupied. It was badly damaged, half filled with water and ice. Only one oar remained, still frozen in one of the crewmen's hands. The crew was poorly dressed and provisioned, with crewman Thomas being the only one wearing an overcoat. Steward George Smith reportedly brought 2 knives and a meat cleaver with him. Much was made of this in Boyer's book, where it was postulated that maybe the crew had rebelled against Captain McLeod. I think this is simply an example of crewman Smith taking 2 of his prized possessions with him. These would also be useful tools for cutting away ice and other problems. So I'm not at all convinced that there was any type of a mutiny on the number 2. I don't agree with Boyer's theory here. There are other things we can infer from the discovery of lifeboat number 4. One is that if this was indeed the only lifeboat launched, it was launched out of order. Typically, they would go first, second, third, and then fourth. There were no officers aboard. Each boat would have an officer accompanying them, with Captain McLeod being the one to leave on the last lifeboat. The others would have been manned by the first mate, chief engineer, second mate, what have you. This group of crewmen reportedly was off duty between midnight and 6 a.m. Wednesday morning, and it could be safe to assume that maybe the boat sank in that time period. These would be some of the least likely men to survive as a group, according to the Conneaut News Herald, supporting the idea that the boat was launched in great haste. All wore life preservers, and another telling thing is that the lifeboat was only at half capacity. So it's very likely that this lifeboat was launched under great duress and possibly panic as well. Here we see the well-known photograph from the Erie morgue with the occupants of lifeboat number 4. They are Thomas Steele, fireman, age 24; Joseph Shank, or sometimes pronounced Schenk, fireman, age 25; Charles Allen, coal passer, aged approximately 18 years old; George Smith, the steward, aged approximately 33 years;
William Ray was an oiler, age 25 years. John Paddy Hart, also an oiler, age 38 years. Harry Thomas was the second cook, age 22. R. Hines was a coal passer, age unknown. And J.W. or Manny Sowers was a waiter, age 20. Here we see the information that's available about the other lifeboats. The flotation tanks of one lifeboat was found near Port Burwell. This is just west of Long Point in Ontario. The broken remains of one of the other lifeboats was found on the Buffalo Breakwall 4 months later. I had always presumed that this lifeboat had been unoccupied, although perhaps that's not true. Some have speculated that it was indeed launched and it would help account for some of the bodies that were recovered in the eastern basin, although currents also could have taken bodies there as well. Multiple sightings of the number 2 lifeboat ultimately resulted in it being found about 8 miles east of Port Burwell. There were many, many different reports of the sighting of this boat. It had been reported with and without oars. The one consensus is that apparently it was never launched, even though an initial report had said that there were 3 bodies on board. That was later repudiated. It may have broken free after the ship sank, and that would explain why it's a bit further north than some of the other wreckage. The number 2 may have also had some smaller metallic yawl boats. However, this is the summary of the 4 main boats. Here is a photograph of the number 2 lifeboat being returned to the Marquette and Bessemer Dock and Navigation Company on a rail car. If you look closely at the scrapes on the paint, you can see that this boat appears to be of metallic construction, unlike the others which appear to be wooden. This boat also is in much better condition than the number 4 lifeboat recovered off Erie, Pennsylvania. This photograph is courtesy of the Elgin County Archive in Ontario, Canada. For the purposes of our investigation, I'm breaking the wreckage down into 2 distinct groups. The wreckage that was found shortly after the sinking, and then wreckage that was found in the subsequent year, more in the summer and fall, maybe a little bit in the spring of 1910. The first real confirmed report of wreckage we have is on December 10th, Friday morning. The WB Davik encountered a large debris field of wreckage off Long Point, Ontario. The Davik actually had radio and was able to call this in, and this is the first likely confirmation that the ship was sunk. The wreckage is very consistent with the number 2, but we're not absolutely certain at this point. Like other ships in this story, the Davik met a dark fate of their own. The Davik was lost with all hands in the Armistice Day storm of 1940. It's 2 days later, on Sunday, that the Perry finds the number 4 lifeboat off Erie, PA. Next are multiple reports of the number 2 lifeboat and wreckage associated with it in the Port Burwell area. Then we have some things which are less likely to be true. The tug Reed reports finding the spar of the sunken number 2 sticking up out of the water about 12 miles north of Conneaut. That sort of corroborates where the lifeboat was found. In April 1910, a signboard from the number 2 was also located at Point Garreau. The tugboat Reed, that report was later discredited. Here on the chart, we see the early distribution of wreckage right after the storm. As you can see, the arrows depict the wind direction, typically coming from the west to southwest, with a northwest wind building out of the Canadian shore on Wednesday morning. We also have the letters that depict the wreckage itself. The letter A represents the large debris field located by the Davik on Friday morning, December 10th. The letter B represents the lifeboat found on December 12th north of Erie, PA. And then C represents the number 2 lifeboat all the way up north at the base of Long Point. In the spring, summer, and fall of 1910, large amounts of wreckage start to find their way ashore, both in Canada and to a lesser extent on the Ohio and Pennsylvania coast. In March of 1910, Fred Green finds the top half of his stateroom door, a piece of a cabin roof, and a door panel.
with a porcelain tag on it. The porcelain tag was numbered, indicating it was a stateroom or a guest room, which the Marquette Bessemer No.2 did have. In March 1910, there are also two fantastic reports of rail cars and the ship itself being seen under the ice by parties walking 14 miles from Port Bruce and 8 to 10 miles from Port Stanley on the ice in deeper water. One wonders what they might have been doing out there, and I didn't give this report a lot of credence when I first saw it, but it is theoretically possible. And large rewards were offered for recovery of the crewmen or anything related to the finding of the ship. So there may have been motivated parties out there looking on the ice. If this story is true, they never apparently were able to find their way back, or no one believed them. In May of 1910, search parties found large quantities of debris all along Long Point, Ontario, including the side of a freight car. This one astounded me for a bit, and it's the only report that I have seen of such a thing. It's a small blurb out of the Detroit Free Press. And I'm thinking, how do you have the side of a hopper car? And then it dawned on me. These hopper cars, some of them at least, were wooden. You would have still had some wooden cars in service at that time. One of them must have broken up when it hit the bottom, and the side of the car managed to find its way ashore. Probably not terribly far from the sinking site. In September 1910, an Erie fisherman pulls up an axe with the name of the ship on it. He declines to assign a location to the axe, and this was out of Ashtabula. But I don't put a ton of credence in this. That ship axe may have traveled on the ice. It may have fallen overboard at any time. So there are a myriad of ways that it can get there. It may not have marked the location of the wreck. Years later, clues to the location of our ghost ship continue to roll in. In 1914, a message in the bottle was found off Erie, Pennsylvania, reportedly from passenger Albert Weiss. It was determined, however, that this was a cruel hoax. Albert's handwriting did not match that in the note, at least based on the opinion of one of his coworkers. And in the signature, his name was misspelled, transposing the I and the E. Obviously, this was a fraud and a very cruel joke. In 1928, another bottle was found, and I'm not so certain about this one. It was found in a Port Stanley beach, and it had a note scrawled on an old magazine cover in pencil, reporting that the Marquette Bessemer No.2 was sinking 15 miles south of Port Stanley. It was unsigned, or the signature had faded. I thought this was a very credible and interesting clue. However, subsequent to my writing of the book, I did discover one newspaper article that had indicated that a person had examined the bottle about the same time as its finding, indicated that they didn't feel like the cork showed enough damage to have been in the water for 18 years. So perhaps this one was also a fake. On July 10th, 1932, the package freighter Jack was disabled after striking a large underwater obstruction 35 miles south of Long Point. It had to be towed in, and Dwight Boyer had postulated that maybe that what the obstruction was the Marquette Bessemer No.2. There's not much follow up on this story, and at the time I thought it was a fascinating clue. However, that's a very broad area, so it's not exactly a perfect location. The Jack itself was another unfortunate ship tied to this story, torpedoed by the U-558 between Haiti and Jamaica on May 27, 1942. 37 lives were lost. Then in August 1963, Captain Sam Moore loses a $600 fishing trawl on a large underwater obstruction. That's $600 in 1963 dollars. Moore passed the coordinates on to Donna Rodabaugh, who was reported to have launched an expedition to find the wreck, one of several that she had attempted in her life. But however, she was unsuccessful. In 1975, fisherman Larry Jackson pulls up a railing matching that of the Marquette Bessemer No.2 using mechanical means. I would suspect a fishing trawl. He would not divulge the location and was seeking salvage rights for the ship. There have also been reports of the Marquette Bessemer No.2 being seen by air 8 miles off Ashtabula. I have never been able to translate this into a finding and cannot confirm the source of any of those reports. Courtesy of NOAA, Here is a map of the currents in Lake Erie. While this is relatively recent, I am making the assumption that the current pattern in the Great Lakes have not changed greatly and that this is very similar to what we would see in 1910. In part, this can be instructive for us ruling out certain areas of the lake for the sinking. I firmly believe that the wreck has to be located somewhere between Ashtabula and the Port Stanley Canadian coast area and the tip of Long Point. If we see the wreckage pattern in 1910, we had wreckage washing up on Long Point in large quantities. Then we had some wreckage pushing past that and being driven to the south, making the Ohio coast and also the Pennsylvania coast. Then some wreckage was driven all the way down into the eastern basin. This is exactly what the currents would have done after the storm a year later. So that's why I think that the wreck has to be in that area. If we look at the western part of the lake, the currents are pushing the wreckage potentially in a counterclockwise pattern back toward Lorraine and Sandusky, and then maybe pushing up the Ohio coast. If that was the case, we would have had a lot of wreckage in the Cleveland, Ashtabula, Ohio coast area. That didn't happen. The bulk of the wreckage wound up in Ontario. That's why I think that this current map is instructive and helpful. While there were no survivors of the Marquette and Bessemer No.2, there were those that did make it home nonetheless. Some shortly after the wreck, some quite a bit later. Harry Thomas and Roy Hines were among those recovered in lifeboat No.4. They were returned to Ontario and they are interred at the United Union Church Cemetery in Union, Ontario. Charles Allen, one of the youngest members of the crew, who was only 18, was also recovered in lifeboat No.4. He's interred at North Bend Cemetery in North Bend, Pennsylvania. William Ray was among those recovered in lifeboat No.4 as well. He is reported to be interred in the Southside Cemetery in Butler, Pennsylvania. John Patty Hart and Joseph Schenck were among those recovered in lifeboat No.4 and are interred at the Trinity Cemetery in Erie, Pennsylvania. The graves are reported to be unmarked. George Smith, also recovered in lifeboat No.4, was the gentleman who brought aboard the knives and the meat cleaver. And this was one of the things that caused Dwight Boyer to speculate there may have been a mutiny on the ship. He is interred not far from his captain in the city cemetery in Conneaut, Ohio. There is a grave marker. John W. or Manny Sowers was among those recovered in lifeboat No.4. There are many different spellings of his name. He is reportedly interred at the St. Joseph Cemetery in Conneaut, Ohio. Thomas Steele was also recovered in lifeboat No.4. He was from Edinburgh, Scotland, and had been with the ferry for 2 years. On May 2nd, in spring of 1910, local farmer R. Scott found a floating body near shore. Personal effects identified this man as Eugene Wood, a chief engineer of the car ferry. Due to the advanced stage of decomposition, interment was performed immediately at Port Dalhousie, Ontario. Wood's brother George was captain of the steamer Bannockburn, which floundered approximately November 21st, 1902. No bodies were ever recovered from Bannockburn and has never been located. It is reputed to be the Flying Dutchman of the Great Lakes. Eugene, unlike his brother George, was able to make it home. On October 10th, 1910, wheelsman William Wilson, identified by his prized 17-jewel Waltham watch, was washed up on the beach at Long Point. This quotation by Boyer sums it up best. Lighthouse keeper S.B. Cook made a rough coffin and buried him there on the point, where he still sleeps away his own personal eternity. On April 7th of 1910, Captain John McLeod, first mate of the No.2, is recovered in a water intake for a Niagara Falls Power Company. Identification was made by John's personal papers and effects. His watch appeared to have stopped at 12:25. John McLeod is interred at the Our Lady of Mercy Cemetery in Sarnia, Ontario. There is a headstone. In April of 1910, Patrick Keith was recovered about 3 miles off Port Colborne, Ontario. He was identified by a distinctive scar over his right eye. Throughout the summer and fall of 1910, more bodies are recovered. July 26th. A frightfully decomposed body washed up on the beach at Hart's Farm above Waldemere, Pennsylvania. The body was clad only in knit porous underwear and its features were obliterated, making identification impossible. This body may, however, have been one of the members of the car ferry crew. On September 21st, the fishing tug Cisco brought in a body it found far out on the lake. The body was unrecognizable, but because of some of the clothing, it was thought to be a member of the car ferry's crew. And in October of 1910, a trunk and head of a man believed to be one of the ill-fated crew was picked up on a long point by a crew of the tug Schaefer. Finally, 10 months after the sinking, Captain McLeod was recovered on Long Point, either on October 5th or 6th, depending on the report. Captain McLeod was positively identified by the name tattooed on his arm. Depending on the day, it was roughly the fifth anniversary of when he took over command of the number 2 on its maiden voyage, and also the day the replacement Marquette Bessemer No.2 left Conneaut on its maiden voyage to Port Stanley. Captain McLeod is interred at the city cemetery in Conneaut, Ohio, and there is a grave marker. Based on the reports I was able to locate, it appears that 14 crewmen and officers were positively identified and recovered. It's probable that there were another 3 or 4 also recovered, but these men were unidentifiable. Albert Weiss was not among those recovered, as he possessed a distinctive dental work that was not found among the bodies that came in. There is some debate as to the number lost on the ship. I put it at 32 officers and crew and 2 passengers, and this is a topic that is open to debate as it is somewhat uncertain. We will never know for sure. So, where is our ghost ship hiding? After 116 years on the bottom of Lake Erie, no one has been able to definitively locate this ship. If someone has, they may have taken the secret to the grave. It's a very complex puzzle. Between the many, sometimes conflicting reports of the number 2, the widely dispersed wreckage, and the fact that we have no concrete time for when she actually sank, it's not surprising there are so many divergent theories as to where she is resting. The possibilities seem endless. There are also what seem like endless breadcrumbs of clues, rumors, and reports that support widely different versions of how and where the ship met its end. In this chapter, I'm going to try and summarize these and see if we can't eliminate some of the possibilities based on evidence. I'm going to go over 3 different theories and why I think 2 are more likely than the other. My first theory about the location of the Marquette and Bessemer No.2 was one that was brought up in Dwight Boyer's 1968 book and also in previous newspaper articles. The idea was that the package freighter Jack struck an underwater obstruction in 1932, approximately 35 miles southwest of Long Point. That covers a big area, but the location does check a lot of boxes, and it would account for the discovery of the number 4 lifeboat and subsequent wreckage along Long Point as well. This location was supposed to be marked as a navigation hazard. I'm not certain that that ever happened, but it is a nice possible middle of the lake location, which would be in a low traffic area for recreational boaters and divers. So that could account for why the ship has been harder to find. The problem I have with this that's bothered me more and more as I look at it is that the lifeboat number 2 is a bit far north for me, making this my third favorite of the location theories now, even though going into this research it was one of my preferred ideas. On this map, A represents the debris field encountered by the Davik, B represents lifeboat number 4, and C represents lifeboat number 2, all with their attendant wreckage. There are a lot of assumptions based on this. When they say off Long Point, assuming they mean off the Long Point lighthouse at the tip. So, using a compass and marking a line 35 miles southwest and crossing the prevailing shipping lines in the middle of the lake, I put the large orange band in there, where I think the Jack may have collided with some type of underwater obstruction. Unfortunately, the Jack's logbook has not been available, and so more specific information, if it's out there, I haven't been able to locate it. But this is about the approximate area I think they're talking about.
And as you can see, with the prevailing winds on the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th, which are marked by the blue and red arrows, I'm not certain how lifeboat number 2 got so far north on December 10 or 11. So this has become one of my less preferred location ideas. I like theory number 2 better. That's the run to the south. It fits the narrative that Captain McLeod did make it to Port Stanley, being cited by Customs Agent Wheeler, and that he did take a turn to port. He would have done that regardless because he wasn't going to turn to starboard and expose his boat to boarding seas. But rather than attempt to go to Rondow, which may not have been a better option really than Port Stanley, what if he was going to just turn southwest, keeping the ship into the wind and trying to make a larger shelter, like Ashtabula, Fairport, or Cleveland? This buys the captain time. Most Great Lakes storms didn't last 3 days like this one did, and he may have been thinking he just needed to ride it out. He may have been seeking a larger harbor that was more accessible with better protection. It also fits the wreckage pattern after the sinking nicely. Granted, the lifeboat number 4 would have had to drift a considerable distance, but if it drifted 73 miles, that's only a mile and a half an hour, found at 48 hours after launch. It also fits the timing. If the boat went down Wednesday night on this course, it would have made sense that the reserve crew would have been off duty and may have abandoned the ship at that time. It's also a mid-lake, low-traffic area, which could account for the ship not being found. Once again, the arrows represent wind direction. The letter A represents the debris field of the davit, B represents the number 4 lifeboat, and C represents the number 2 lifeboat. The red line represents the ship's normal course from Conneaut to Port Stanley. The 3 blue lines represent courses to the south or southwest that Captain McLeod may have taken had he actually, in fact, made it to Port Stanley and been seen by Wheeler on December 7th. The green line represents a route that the replacement Marquette Bessemer No.2 sometimes took from Conneaut to Ariel or Rondow. And I included this because Boyer reported that the replacement ship did strike an underwater obstruction on its way to Rondow in subsequent years. Consequently, he theorized it could have been the number 2, the original ship. And as you can see, I've included small circles in that intersection area where the ship and the course may have collided. I moved the Ashtabula circle further north because if we look at the intersection to the south, it would have been far too south to have been realistic based on the wreckage we saw. As we move further west, I would have expected more wreckage to accumulate on the Ohio coast. That didn't happen. So my thinking is if this scenario actually took place, I think Captain McLeod may have selected Fairport because it was closer and also a good shelter. And these are just theoretical course lines, but I think that the ship may have been lost Wednesday night on that course line, more likely on the Canadian side of the lake, because the further north we are, the better the wreckage pattern fits. I don't think that he got into Ohio waters. Theory 2 checks a lot of boxes. It's basically my runner-up choice, 1A and 1B as it were. But like everything else in the narrative of this ship, there are reasons to question it. For this theory to be accurate, we have to discount every single sighting or report of the ship after the initial Port Stanley sighting on Tuesday afternoon as false. Some of the reports were later recanted, but a few are hard for me to let go of, especially Mrs. McLeod's. She heard her husband's ship's whistle on Wednesday night, and surely she should know the sound of the ship. Some of the other reports also seem credible. Some of these people had to see something. I wonder if it wasn't the number 2, but perhaps the W.C. Richardson, half flooded after taking extra ballast on off Conneaut Harbor. The day is not reported in the article that I saw, but the ship had to lumber slowly up the coast of Buffalo. Possibly that was what these people saw. That would, of course, account for some of these sightings. But otherwise, we have to basically throw them out. This location does fit the post-storm wreckage distribution, In the following spring, however, assuming lake currents are stable, more wreckage probably would have been found further west and on the Ohio shore the further west we go along these routes. Uh, it fits the wreckage pattern better if it's lost mid lake, somewhere slightly north of mid lake on this route. That would account for everything that we saw. Theory number one, that she's still off Port Stanley, probably somewhere to the southeast. This allows us to accept some or the bulk of the reports and sightings on both sides of the lake. The idea being is after the ship made Port Stanley on Tuesday, she turned to port, returned to the Ohio coast, couldn't get in at Conneaut or along the Ohio Erie shore, decided that she couldn't hide in the lee of the shore anymore, and ran back up to Port Stanley again, approaching from the southeast on a northwest course. The wreckage right after the storm in this scenario is very plausible, especially if a northwest wind is coming out of Port Stanley. The lifeboat number 2 fits here, especially if she broke free after the sinking, and it's less distance for heavier wreckage like the side of a rail car and brass fittings to travel. It fits the wreckage found in the spring of 1910 with the prevailing currents dragging wreckage and bodies along Long Point, bouncing them off Ohio shore and off into the eastern basin, which is exactly what happened. This scenario also fits some of the other subsequent reporting, both after the sinking and years later. The wild sightings of the ship below the ice by the shore parties in March of 1910, could they actually have been true, where they saw the ship about 10-15 miles southeast of Port Stanley? The second message in the bottle, which reports that the ship sank 15 miles south of Port Stanley, could that actually be legitimate? One of the advantages of putting all one's ideas out there on paper is that people will send you subsequent information. One lady from Buffalo did send me an article, and in there it said that the expert who looked at the second message in the bottle wasn't certain that the cork had been aged enough to have been in the water that long. So maybe that wasn't an accurate report. We'll never know for sure. Larry Jackson pulling up a section of railing with a fresh break that very much fits the wreckage. Is that something that was true? Jackson was known to fish further out south of Port Stanley. It also fits the narrative of Captain McLeod finding a nighttime approach to another small harbor just being far too dangerous. Perhaps after failing to make any progress on the Ohio coast, he decided to make a nighttime run to the northwest, hoping that he could try another daytime approach to Port Stanley when the weather was more agreeable. Perhaps that was the best chance to save his boat in his mind. And then, of course, the common narrative is that the reason the ship has never been found is because it was lost in much deeper water in the eastern basin of the lake. There are a couple reasons why I don't believe that happened, why he didn't turn up toward Erie or try and shelter below Long Point. Part of it is, of course, the physical wreckage, which is far too west. But beyond that, Captain McLeod didn't do it because he knew he couldn't. You'll recall that the Marquette Bessemer No.1 left harbor before the No.2 on the fateful day of Tuesday, December 7th, captained by Murdoch Rowan. Captain Rowan was reported to have completed his trip and then traveled around the lake trying to find the No.2, making a complete circle and moving back down along the Ohio coast. What's interesting about that is that's one of those historical errors that's been reported as factual, really for a very long time. But if you go through the records, you will find that the Conneaut News Herald reports that on December 14th, I believe it was, Captain Rowan did not do that. He instead took off and hid behind Long Point and survived the storm there, completing his delivery only 8 days later. Because of this, one wonders why Captain McLeod didn't do the same option. I believe he made it to Port Stanley, and the reason he didn't turn east is because he knew he couldn't. Captain Rowan had a boat where he could handle water coming over the stern. Captain McLeod didn't. He never took that chance. That's why the ship can't be further east, both because of the wreckage and because of the captain's judgment. In this scenario, I've drawn a 15-mile arc around Port Stanley, and the red line shows the approach from Conneaut. And where the line intersects the arc, there's a possibility that's where the ship may have gone down. It fits a lot of the physical wreckage and a lot of the verbal reports. And it does account for the number 2 lifeboat, especially if it broke free after the sinking. That is a clue that I think supports this location very much. So I think that the ship will ultimately be encountered in one of these 2 areas, either here or closer to mid lake on a southwest course toward one of the bigger ports. A third option was introduced by Brendan Bellot in a terrific presentation this summer, where he indicated he doesn't think the ship made it to Port Stanley at all and sank Tuesday afternoon, maybe along the same course line. That also is a distinct possibility. That very well may have happened. It all depends how much credibility you want to put in the eyewitness reports and how much you want to use them to shape your narrative. In any case, while the ship hasn't definitively been found, I think we are certainly narrowing down the potential locations of the ship.
1909 was a year of transition and labor strife. It was also a record setting year for cargo moved. This came at a cost, however, both in ships and men, some of whom were experienced and some of whom probably never should have been out on the lake in the first place. Ultimately, this wasn't all for naught. Safety improvements did come from this year. Some companies reevaluated the wisdom of sending ships out in December. More ships got wireless radio. Critically, railroad car ferries got stern gates, which helped enhance their safety. Regardless, in the coming decades, many men would lose their lives on the Great Lakes, although their sacrifice did help build the United States into the industrial superpower that would help win 2 world wars. And that's not inconsequential. Undoubtedly, the wreck will be a ghostly sight, standing watch over some of the crew and passengers who are most likely still entombed there. The wreck stands as a time capsule for us to look into a different era, and a monument to all those who served on the Great Lakes, including her crew, whether the ship is ever found or not.
If you've made it this far, thank you. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert at putting audio to PowerPoint. It may not be my best skill. In any event, I hope that this prompts you to look further into more history of the Great Lakes. You can read more about this in my book, which is available if you cut and paste the link into Ingram's Spark below. Also, you can get the book pretty much any place books are retailed. Additionally, if you want to support your local museums or merchants, the book is also available for retail purchase at the National Great Lakes Museum in Toledo, Ohio, the Sandusky Maritime Museum, and the Ashtabula Transportation Museum. You can also purchase the book at Max Back's bookstore in Cleveland Heights if you're ever in any of these areas. Anyway, I hope this prompts you to research more about the Marquette and Bessemer No.2 and also any other Great Lakes history that catches your attention. Thanks again for your patience.